So, and looks like sadly I have to give the floor to myself because next item, item 6 on the agenda is objection according to Rule 106 on list of invasive alien species. As you may remember, invasive alien species regulation was tabled by the Commission in the end of 2013 and adopted by the Parliament and the Council in the first reading in the spring 2014. And 2014 was quite an election year, and it was really difficult to adopt the file, to negotiate the file of this speed. The proposal was tabled without its key element, the list of invasive alien species of Union concern. It was quite difficult to negotiate the regulation without this list. During negotiations, we did all possible to avoid this particular situation which we are facing today, when both the Member States and the Commission refused to accept a delegated act for establishing the list of invasive alien species of Union concern. Final agreement was reached only after negotiating parties agreed in the trialogue that the delegated act on the risk assessment for the invasive alien species to be listed will be adopted before drafting the list. It apparently did not happen, and I am objecting now the draft list on the invasive alien species of Union concern. The reasons are rather complex and are described in the text of the objection. We have a lot to discuss today, so I would like to touch only two outstanding issues. One is the purpose of the delegated act on risk assessment, and second is the result or possible result of the approach used by the Commission after the processes foreseen by the legislation were not fulfilled. On the delegated act on the risk assessment, the Commission has sent to the Environment Committee after the objection was tabled, so-called information note, where it is stated, quote, in order to take into account the latest scientific development, the regulation also foresees an empowerment for the Commission to develop a delegated act according Article 5.3 to further specify the type of evidence acceptable to evaluate whether species is capable of establishing a viable population and spreading in the environment, and to provide a detailed description of the application of the elements which need to be taken in consideration to develop risk assessment. End of quote. It sounds like if the delegated act according to Article 5.3 of the regulation is something voluntary, complementary, specifying only certain elements, something what, and quote again from the Commission's statement, can be tackled in a later stage. In reality, the delegated act on the risk assessment, according to Article 5.3, is crucial to obtain correct, transparent, and comparable risk assessments from the Member States, necessary to list those invasive alien species on the Union list which fulfill all 5 criteria set up in Article 4.2. It is intended, and here I dare quote from the regulation, the part which the Commission diplomatically omitted in its note, quote, to provide a detailed description of the application of the points A to H of paragraph 1 of this article, meant Article 5. The detailed description shall include the methodology to be applied in the risk assessments, taking into account relevant national and international standards and the need to prioritize action against invasive alien species associated with or that have a potential to cause a significant adverse impact on biodiversity or related ecosystem services, etc., etc., end of quote. Aware of this, negotiating parties agreed on the implementing act for the establishing the list with the condition that the delegated act is prerequisite for adopting the implementing act establishing the list of invasive alien species of Union concern. It is I say outrageous that the Commission is now saying that, quote again, the regulation does not state, end of quote, this because it is clear from the text of the Article 5.3, I quote it above, that it is necessary. It is clear that using flaved processes can only lead to flaved results. It happened as the Commission based the draft proposal on the years-old list of invasive species, using years-old risk assessments and giving the priority to the political pressure against costs for member states. The Commission calls this step 2 where, quote, elements of Article 4.6 were considered, end of quote. Result is really poor, and as I have spoken with experts who participated on the drafting of the list, and even they are not comfortable with content of the list. This is a draft list where none of terrestrial plant species of DayC 100, worst invasive alien species of Europe, is present. Draft list where, for example, turtle Chrysamis picta, supposed to be on the list even according to recital 14 of the regulation, is missing. Where American mink, which is one of the worst invasive alien species in the EU, is not listed. The list where is listed South American coati, Nassua, living only somewhere on the Balear Islands, or Parthenium weed, which is barely present in the EU. List where is listed raccoon, but not raccoon dog, which is more spread and probably more dangerous to the ecosystems and ecosystem services in the EU than the first one. Where is listed garden plant Lysichiton, American skunk cabbage, but one of most dangerous and currently spreading invasives, knotweed. No one of knotweed species is listed. Eichhornia, water hyacinth, is on the list, but highly allergenic ambrosia is missing. Two minor hogweed species, Sosnovsky and Persicum, are listed, whilst Jan hogweed, one of the most dangerous, most poisonous and devastating invasive alien plants, is missing, despite all the risk assessment for the first two species are only derived from that for the giant hogweed. Why this should be a problem when the list can be later updated? It is very simple. I have been working on invasive alien species for the last 20 years, and after this experience I can tell you one thing for sure. To build the confidence and cooperation with the public is the basic condition for successful tackling of any invasive alien species problem. When this is damaged by one wrong step, one wrong proposal, the confidence would be hardly found again, and it takes years to get back cooperation of the public. When this proposal of the Commission is adopted, no one can explain to the people in Europe why the EU bans their favorite aquatic plants only, and doing nothing about most dangerous invasive alien organisms causing harm to them, ecosystems and economy. The Commission said that it was motivated by the time shortage and that the waiting for the delegated acts we discussed in the very beginning would undermine the achievement of the EU 2020 biodiversity target. First, it was the Commission who tabled the proposal of the regulation with nearly 2-year-long delay, and it is again the Commission who proposes the list, which can push us not few months, what would cost to undergo proper procedure, but years back because of loss of the confidence of the European public. So please, Commission, take this proposal back, prepare necessary conditions for risk assessments, then take into account all you have taken into account, explain to the member states that there is also something like cost of inaction, not only cost of action, and then come back with new, better proposal. Yes, and now for EPP was Renate Sommer. I don't see her. She's not here. So, okay. No. Ah, yes.
Yes, Chair, can I make a point of order?
Yeah, please.
Is it a good idea to ask the Commission to respond first? Because we can all repeat things, but maybe it's better to listen to the Commission first before we give our statements from our side.
I think when there is actually no ask for for the floor, and it is...
We can give the floor to the Commission and then...
Yeah, and it is not the case. We can, I think, give the floor to the Commission first. Yes, if Commission agrees. So, yes, do you agree?
Yes.
So, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, the honourable members. I would first of all thank you for allowing us to explain the process that we have adopted in preparing this first list of union concern. And I would like to reiterate and stress that the Commission is fully committed to a full implementation of the regulation 1143/2014, which I will name the Invasive Alien Species Regulation. That is indeed, as we have outlined in our midterm review of the biodiversity strategy, a fundamental step and piece of legislation in contributing towards our joint objective to halt the loss of biodiversity in the European Union by 2020. Now, a very important first step is a rapid adoption of this list. And in many draft reactions from the European Parliament, from the Council, from the Committee of the Regions to the European Commission's report on the midterm review, there has been a call to do whatever we can to have a rapid adoption of this first list, because that triggers the activation of a number of elements in the regulation that are really important, because it makes it necessary for the member states to put in place the necessary instruments so that they can then implement the most important elements of the regulation. For example, the containment measures, the early eradication measures, the trade prohibition measures, etc. Now, I will not repeat all of the elements that have been included in the Commission note, but I will react in particular to a few elements that have been said. For example, just a recollection of the adoption of the regulation in the trilogue. In fact, the proposal to empower the Commission to adopt a delegated act that specifies further the criteria was already in the original proposal from the European Commission. So this is not something that came only during the trilogue. That was already in the original proposal by the Commission. And the Commission does indeed believe that it is important to have this empowerment, and we are actually committed to develop such a delegated act. But we wanted first to learn from the process of adopting the first list on what are actually the elements in the criteria that are listed in Article 4.3 that would need further specification, because they are, as they are already quite clear, and we have done a study in which we have identified what they mean, and we have discussed this with the experts and with the committee in charge. I also do not agree that the Commission has been or has established the list following political pressures, but we have rather scrupulously followed the criteria that are listed in the regulation itself in determining which species to be put on the list and which species not to be put on the list. And one of the most important criteria is that there is a risk assessment that fulfills the criteria outlined in Article 4.3. And therefore, there are several species that were mentioned by the honourable member, for example, the American mink or the raccoon dog, where not all of the elements were already, or there was no risk assessment available that was fulfilling those criteria. And we actually know that member states are working on further improving the risk assessments. As soon as the risk assessments of those species are fulfilling the criteria, the Commission will not hesitate to put those species on the list so that they will be submitted to the committee in charge. It is, in fact, there are many very invasive plant species that are on the list because they had a risk assessment that was fulfilling the criteria. I would just name, for example, the water hyacinth, which is creating enormous damages in the Guadiana River, and it is very important that we do not delay the adoption of the first list so that member states can take the measures necessary in order to really contain the further spread of this very invasive species. And there are many more species on the list that have a proven record of being very invasive and a big threat to the biodiversity in the European Union. So this is why we thought it would not have been wise to first have a long discussions on further specification of the criteria that are already clear in the regulation, but to prioritize our work on having those species that have a good risk assessment available, put on the first list, and have a rapid adoption of this list. We are committed to further update the list next year when many of the species mentioned by the honourable member will have the risk assessments available that meet the criteria. And we also believe that it's very important that this is being done as soon as possible. Now, another comment that was made in the draft resolution that there was not enough information of the Parliament and the wider public of the process made. I just want to reiterate that all the minutes of the committee meetings, all the studies that the Commission have done, all the relevant information has been put on the comitology register on the webpage of the European Commission and on the register of the committee itself. So we believe that we have made all the relevant information available to the public, and we have always been ready to answer any question that was asked to us, and we will continue to endeavour to do so also by the members of the European Parliament. I would leave it to that. I just want to summarize that the Commission has scrupulously followed the regulation. It's maybe one point just to reiterate that the regulation does not stipulate that the delegated act that specifying the elements of the risk assessment would be a prerequisite for the adoption of the list. We have also checked this with the legal service of the European Commission because there is a deadline given to the Commission to submit the first list before the 2nd of January, and therefore there is no deadline in further specifying the elements for the delegated act. Therefore, it is not correct to say that it is a prerequisite to adopt the delegated act, further specifying the elements or the criteria before the first list can be adopted. We believe it is much better to further specify those criteria when we had the experience in adopting the first list that, I reiterate, contains species that have a good risk assessment that fulfills the criteria outlined in Article 4.3 of the regulation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, and now time for to give the floor to honourable colleagues, and I have two members. Yes, honourable MEP Fjellner.
Thank you very much. Today I'm Renate Sommer, even though it might not be that obvious to most of you. Just today. First of all, and I have got a fantastic speaking note here, but I'm gonna skip through it because I think most of us actually know that this is an important issue and that it costs a lot of money and all of those things. But even after listening to the Commission, I must say that I still have my doubts on whether this was actually is well organized, built upon the new standardized risk assessment and methodology, especially when I look at the result. Because I hear what the Commission say, that they think there are a lot of species that doesn't have this new standardized risk assessment from member states well enough yet. But there are still a lot of animals and invasive species that is very hard to understand why they are not on the list. And on the other hand, there are at least some species that I have a hard time understanding why they are on the list. And I've got plenty of examples here from Ms. Sommer, but I'll use my own experience and now it's getting scary when I'm supposed to use my own and leave the speaking notes for a while. But, for example, if I just look at water-living animals and what we've debated in Sweden for a long time, we have the American lobster, for example, that have proven to be a big challenge and a huge threat to a lot of lobsters in Sweden. Isn't mentioned. The Pacific oyster that we know in parts of Europe has been grown, but now is spreading in a way that threatens lobsters in Sweden massively. The round goby, that is a fish, that is also a big challenge. None of those three that I know is on the top of the agenda and is on the top of the mind and policy-wise in Sweden isn't on the list. But on the other hand, the signal crayfish is there, that is being breeded and harvested in Sweden. Then I've understood, because I was in contact with the Commission and other experts, saying that most people in Sweden shouldn't worry on the fact that the signal crayfish is on the list. It won't mean that we will have to stop breed them and that we will not be able to harvest them anymore. But if that's the case, then I wonder what is it doing on the list, and does it really matter if it is on the list? So it gives me, this list doesn't give me comfort. It gives me more concern, actually, on whether we're focusing where I know people in my constituency have their major concern. And the only reaction when I've spoken to people back home about this list has been concern about species that are on the list, rather than that it helps them tackle the species that they really worry about, like, as I said, the American lobster and the Pacific oyster. So therefore, I won't judge on whether we were properly informed or not, but it's hard to see the logic of this list coming out of a process that we all value very much and think is very important. So I, on behalf of the EPP, we're not convinced as it stands right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now Gerber and Gerbrandi.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Where to start? Let's start with the midterm review on the biodiversity strategy. That was a rather, black review, I must say, with a lot of red lights, but there was one green light, and the green light was on invasive alien species and the fight against them. And why did we have a green light there? And not because we are very effective on the ground in tackling this problem, no, because on paper everything seemed to be in place. And so we were on track, and we were just waiting for the next phase, and that is getting to do the job in real life, in practice. And that is, as far as I'm concerned, exactly what the Commission now is doing. We mandated the Commission, and we also set a rather tight deadline on the 2nd of January of next year, that's within 1 month, to draft the first list of invasive alien species that were to be fought at European level. Is this list perfect? No, not at all. Just one example, in my own country, the Netherlands, we have a huge problem with a rat called the musk rat. And we have been fighting this rat for years, not because we don't like the particular animal, but because it is undermining our dikes. And in the week that the climate summit has started in Paris, and next to mitigation, adaptation is a very sensitive issue, the muskrat plays a very important role in making it difficult for us in the Netherlands to adapt better to climate change, because they're undermining our dikes. And I must say that I'm surprised that the muskrat is not on the list right now. But does that mean that the list itself is something that I should object to? I'm not convinced about that. We should avoid that the best is the enemy of the good. I think that the Commission did its job, given the time the deadline we set, and we asked them to come with a first draft before the 2nd of January 2016. And the list is far from perfect. But there are sufficient, as the Commission already indicated, sufficient tools to enlarge the risk or to adapt the risk in the list in the coming years. So I am confident that the Commission is going to do that. One element that was put forward by the two colleagues that tabled the objection is that it's more based on political criteria than on science. Well, I'm not a scientist in this field myself, so I have to base myself on what others are saying. What I do know is that if we discuss such a scientifically based list in this House, that we are, by definition, including political criteria. Colleague Fjellner said that he was talking not only based on the list that he was given by Frau Sommer, but also based on his own experience. I can imagine that that is a political judgment as well, more than only a scientific one. So I'm slightly surprised that we are having this debate right now. I have the feeling that we should have more confidence in the Commission here. I'm also slightly surprised by the coalition formed against this draft list. I have the feeling that some might want a bigger list, but others a smaller list. Some might argue that then the Commission did a very good job, but I'm not the one to judge. So I'm slightly surprised, and my group definitely wants to give the European Commission the benefit of the doubt, as long as the Commission claims that this is still ongoing work, and that this first list is just the first step in a huge battle against invasive alien species. If I get that encouragement from the Commission, then the Liberal Group will definitely vote against the objection. And I think that if we take biodiversity seriously, and if we take the midterm analysis of the biodiversity strategy serious, then we should not block this process of the fight against invasive alien species, but put pressure on the Commission to further work on this in the coming year and not vote down this draft list. Thank you.
Thank you. And Susanne Melior is the next. The floor is yours.
Ja, vielen Dank. Ich glaube, dass der Zeitplan für die
Yes, thank you very much indeed. I think that the timetable from the Commission was in fact more ambitious, and that the problems which have been explained here today link in with that timetable. It's been said that the production of the lists is problematic, and I think that the basic problem is that there were different criteria, and therefore this is a bit of a patchwork, and it was difficult to draw up. So when it comes to the list, I don't think it's really sufficient. I think that there are three very clear problems here. Firstly, the question of when a species becomes invasive, when do we really have to do something to tackle it? Of course, this is a question of costs, and the Commission has already addressed that. What sort of costs arise if you don't act? And as far as I know, Member States really do have, already have produced insufficient notifications. So it really is very difficult to know what the consequential costs would be and what the situation is overall. I think that it is going to be necessary to try and avoid extending this to too many species. I think that we need to be more successful in our work. And thirdly, I think that the production of the list really needs to be based on uniform criteria rather than having these differences across the board, which makes the whole thing look like a sort of patchwork. That's why I'm dissatisfied with this, and I don't think we're going to meet our objectives if we approach this in this way and accept this list. But on the other hand, you have to realise that a first step has to be taken and that second and third steps should follow quite quickly, and that will make it possible for us to make progress, and that would then give the member states an opportunity to really set out what the consequential costs are.
Yeah, Julie.
Thank you. Well, as a member of this unlikely coalition, I'd just like to make a couple of points, and I'll apologise for I was late, so I missed what the Commission said, so my apologies if you've already addressed these. I can catch up on it later. But my main issue here, when one does an objection like this, one doesn't do it lightly, certainly I don't. And having been a shadow rapporteur on this in the last Parliament, we talked a lot. Obviously, as a shadow, you take the time and the trouble to inform yourself around what sorts of nasties are out there in terms of plants and animals and what they might be doing. You take the trouble not just to address issues in your own member state, but to try and understand what's happening in other member states. And having done that, I kind of had a bit of an idea about what I would expect to see on this initial list. And what was quite a shock to me was to discover that a number of the, particularly plants actually in my case, that we had talked about, and we'd sort of thought, well, that's a no-brainer, that's going to appear on the list. They're not on the list. Now, technically, as I understand it, there are reasons for that in terms of the risk assessment and the way that it's being handled by member states and the way that that then comes forward to be on the union list. But if it results in what to me is an unsatisfactory list, I think we should address that now and we should make whatever changes. I totally agree with Gerben-Jan when he says we should put pressure on the Commission to produce a better list. And I'm glad that he also thinks that. But in this particular case, the way to put that pressure is to object to the list, it seems to me, because if we allow the list to go through, then we will inevitably take longer in that process. I think it would send a good signal to the member states that they need to look at this a bit more carefully. And it's not about avoiding those pests, those species which might cost a lot of money to eradicate. It's actually about attacking those ones and dealing with those ones first. So I'm very happy to vote in favour of this objection. I hope it wouldn't mean that there would be any long delays. It just means that we would like a little bit more thought and a little bit more action into dealing with the real problems. Thank you.
Thank you. And when there is no asking for floor, I think that for this occasion I can give one more time, for a very short time, the floor to the Commission to react if they want.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it was clear that we all agree that the list is not yet complete and is not the best list. And I can tell you that there are many out there that think there are too many species on the list, and there are many out there that think that there are not enough species on the list. And this is why we have to get it right. We have to make sure that before we list a species, we have really ascertained that they fulfill the criteria that are in the regulation. And I will use the examples given by a member that spoke. For example, the American lobster. We know that there is work ongoing in preparing a risk assessment. This risk assessment is not yet finalized. This is why it is not on the list today. The signal crayfish is indeed on the list because it has a complete risk assessment, and there were indeed a lot of socio-economic arguments put forward for not putting it on the list. We had discussions on that, and we believe that it's still worth putting it on the list because we have to avoid that it further spreads. There are still some river stream, also in Scandinavia, where this species has not yet invaded those, and it is possible to contain them. The member states where the species exist have a management plan in order to avoid this further spread, but where it is already there, it can be harvested and it can be also put into the commerce. It should just not further spread, and one has to be sure that it doesn't spread in areas where it is not yet established. And there are several such species that might be already widely spread in 1 or 2 member states, but we have to avoid that they are being traded in pet shops, etc., and, for example, go into an island where then they could do a very significant damage. So we do believe that the list is at the level of scientific knowledge that we had at the time when we wanted to meet the deadline, is fulfilling the criteria of the regulation, and we have made sure that we only put there species that fulfill the criteria. I reiterate that work is going on, and we are fully committed to further improve the list as long as those species have a risk assessment and fulfill the criteria of the regulation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I'm really happy to hear that the Commission is so hard caring for deadlines, and I for sure, when we will have a next meeting with Mr. Commissioner Vella, I will ask him about deadlines on a lot of other files. If there would be necessary delegated texts in place, as I mentioned in my introductory word, this discussion would be obsolete. This discussion is held because there is no delegated act on risk assessment. Then I don't care if we have a smaller or bigger list. I want the proper list. As somebody here said, that best is the enemy of the good. Yeah, it is true, but we don't have good. Wrong lists will bring us wrong results, and loss of confidence of European public, because we are not able to explain them why the list of invasive alien species of union and concern looks like this. And I'm truly convinced that it's much more, in this case, much more better to have the list later than have the wrong list. So this was my final word as a rapporteur on this. And this is going to be voted this afternoon at 4, and when passed through, then is to be voted on plenary 2nd of December. I mean the second plenary of December. Now for next item on the agenda, which is again objection, and this time objection against authorization of genetically modified maize, NK 603 T25, and I would like to give the floor to the objectors, and I think first Bart Stais. The floor is yours, Bart.
Dank u, voorzitter.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Colleagues, I worked with Guillaume Ballon, Lynn Boylan, and Eleonora Avey on a draft resolution to give a response to the draft implementation decision from the Commission. And this is to approve this instrument. We know that this GMO is a protein with other phosphates, and if this is approved, then this will lead to an increase in the use of glyphosates in agriculture. We discussed this in the committee. We looked at the International Agency on Cancer Research, and they said that this is possibly carcinogenic. So I would just like to say that we shouldn't really look at the technical issues here. I think we need to look at the political arguments, which I feel are more important. The Commissioner Juncker in his speech on the 15th of July 2015, said that he would not take a decision on the approval of GMOs if that would go against a member state majority. And so if we look at what is being worked at in terms of GMO approval, we see that this is actually not the case. There's a majority in the council, and we have looked at the proposal for legislation on the use or the import of GMO food and seed, and we talked about this in the committee and also in plenary. In the plenary, we made it patently clear that the Commission should provide us with a new proposal. And if we look at our own statement, which garnered a majority in the plenary, and so this means that the approval of import GMOs, if there is an import of new GMOs, so we're going to have to raise an objection. And we requested this of the Commission, and Commissioner Juncker said that we should maintain our position and that the Commission would accommodate us. And we have support from the S&D, the GUI, and so this is something that is going to be approved at 1600 today.
Yeah, thank you. As this is joint debates on two, nearly the same objection on the same item, I think it is fair to give now the floor to the second objector, Honorable Member Dornano.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je vous prie d'excuser Madame Godin qui est absente. Donc...
Mrs. Godin is absent and sends her apologies, so I'm taking her place. The European Commission wants to authorise the import into the European market of products which contain maize, NK603X25 for human and animal food. This is maize which has been modified to be resistant to herbicides based on glyphosate and glyphosate ammonium. Glyphosate is used in Roundup, the most used herbicide in the world, which is manufactured by the same multinational. This resistance to glyphosate is worrying. Even if ESA recently said that things were okay, the opinion remains problematic. Glyphosate is not the only active substance in this, and the International Agency for Research on Cancer showed that glyphosate and other active ingredients can have this negative effect. Glyphosate has been classified as probably carcinogenic. Its danger is not just to farmers who use it, but also when it comes